Brittany Stykes. In the quiet rural landscape of Brown County, Ohio, a young expectant mother was driving to celebrate her father's birthday when her vehicle became a target. What happened on that August afternoon in 2013 would leave investigators with a crime scene that defied explanation. A survivor who couldn't speak of what she witnessed, and a family searching for answers more than a decade later. Could the mystery lie in a chance encounter on a country road? Or had someone deliberately set out to end Brittany Stykes' life? Brittany Stykes was 22 years old and pregnant when she was shot multiple times on August 28, 2013. She had just completed a job interview and was driving along US Highway 68 in her yellow Jeep, heading toward her father's birthday celebration. The route she traveled was familiar territory, a stretch of road that connected communities in this southeastern Ohio county. Nothing about the afternoon suggested danger. Yet somewhere along that highway, someone opened fire on her vehicle. The yellow Jeep was discovered crashed in a wooded area off the highway, and the scene investigators encountered raised immediate questions. Brittany had been struck by multiple gunshots, and her young daughter Aubrey had been shot in the head, but was still alive. The bullets had also hit the driver's side door, suggesting the shooter had approached from that direction. What made the scene particularly puzzling was the complete absence of shell casings, indicating that whoever fired those shots had either used a revolver that retained the casings or had taken time to collect them. This detail suggested planning rather than a spontaneous act of road rage. The Brown County Sheriff's Office launched an intensive investigation, working to understand who would have wanted to harm Brittany and why. Investigators examined her background, relationships, and activities in the days leading up to the shooting, searching for any hint of conflict or threat. Brittany's husband, Shane Stykes, initially drew investigative attention, as spouses often do in such cases, but he was cleared after passing multiple polygraph examinations. Shane has maintained his own theories about what happened, stating his belief about who might be responsible, while being careful not to make direct accusations without proof. The randomness of the attack in such a rural setting generated numerous theories. Road rage seemed possible, perhaps triggered by some perceived slight or aggressive driving. But the thoroughness suggested by the missing shell casings argued against a momentary loss of control. A personal vendetta remained on the investigative radar, though no clear motive or suspect emerged from examining Brittany's life. She had no known enemies, no involvement in anything that would typically make someone a target, and no indication that she anticipated danger that day. Sergeant Quinn Carlson of the Brown County Sheriff's Office has described the case as frustrating, a characterization that reflects the dead ends encountered over more than a decade of investigation. Despite extensive interviews, forensic analysis, and pursuit of tips from the public, investigators have been unable to identify a suspect. The case remains active, with authorities continuing to seek any information that might finally provide a breakthrough. The impact on Brittany's family has been profound and enduring. Her father, David Dodson, carries the additional burden that Brittany was taken from him on his birthday, forever linking celebration with tragedy. For Shane, the loss of his wife and unborn child, while simultaneously facing the recovery of his surviving daughter, created an almost unbearable combination of grief and responsibility. He has spoken about his suspicions regarding who might be responsible. Though without evidence to support charges, his beliefs remain personal rather than actionable. Aubrey's survival, while miraculous, came at a tremendous cost. She required 4 separate brain operations to address the injuries from the gunshot, and her recovery has been a long journey. However, reports indicate that she has thrived academically, demonstrating resilience in the face of trauma that would overwhelm most people. Her success stands as a testament to both her own strength and the support of family who refused to let tragedy define her future. As of 2025, 12 years after Brittany's passing, the case remains unsolved. The questions that emerged on that rural highway in Ohio persist, unanswered despite years of dedicated investigative work. From an Ohio highway to the vast spaces of Western Canada, another case would highlight failures in investigation. Amber Tuccaro. The recorded voice of a woman pleading with her captor would become one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in Canadian criminal history. Amber Tuccaro, a 20-year-old Mikisew Cree First Nation woman, disappeared on August 18, 2010, after accepting a ride from an unidentified man near Edmonton, Alberta. Her case would expose deep flaws in how Indigenous women's disappearances are investigated and become part of a broader reckoning with violence against Indigenous communities in Canada. Amber was from Fort McMurray and was the mother of a young son when she traveled to the Edmonton area in August 2010. She was staying at a hotel in Nisku, a community just south of Edmonton, when she decided to hitchhike. The decision would prove fatal, but it also resulted in the preservation of crucial evidence that investigators would later release to the public. A phone call Amber made while in the vehicle was recorded, capturing her growing concern about where the driver was taking her. The audio recording is chilling in its clarity. Amber can be heard saying to the driver that he had better not be taking her anywhere she didn't want to go, her voice carrying both suspicion and an attempt at assertiveness. The man responds, falsely claiming they are heading to Edmonton when they clearly are not. The conversation captures the last known moments of Amber's life, preserving the voice of her potential abductor, but not his identity. When investigators eventually released this recording to the public in 2012, they hoped someone would recognize the man's voice and mannerisms. Amber's remains were discovered on September 1, 2012, in a rural area of Leduc County, approximately 4 years after her disappearance. Horseback riders made the grim discovery in a field southeast of Edmonton, and the condition of the remains made determining the exact cause of passing difficult. The location was not far from Highway 214, a route that would be consistent with the direction the driver was taking in the recorded conversation. The investigation into Amber's disappearance and passing was conducted by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, but their work came under severe criticism. A 2018 report examining the investigation found it to be deficient in multiple ways, citing delays in response, errors in evidence handling, including the destruction of Amber's belongings, and what appeared to be bias in how the case was prioritized. The failures reflected broader systemic problems in how cases involving Indigenous women were handled, part of an epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls across Canada. RCMP Deputy Commissioner Curtis Zablocki publicly admitted that the investigation did not represent their best work, an acknowledgement that came years too late to help Amber, but reflected growing awareness of the problems. The criticism of the RCMP's handling extended beyond this single case, contributing to a national conversation about violence against Indigenous women and the inadequate responses from law enforcement agencies. The audio recording remains the most significant piece of evidence, and investigators have continued to hope it will lead to identification of the driver. In 2020, police investigated a tip implicating a man, but this lead has not resulted in charges. As of 2025, Amber Tuccaro's case remains unsolved. The recording continues to be available for anyone who might help identify the voice. From Canada to the mountain roads of France, where a family vacation would end in incomprehensible tragedy. French Alps family murder. In a peaceful mountain lay by overlooking Lake Annecy in the French Alps, 4 people were shot multiple times on September 5, 2012, in what would become one of Europe's most puzzling unsolved cases. The victims included a British-Iraqi family on holiday and a French cyclist who may have simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The precision of the attack and the complete absence of a clear motive have kept investigators searching for answers more than a decade later. Saad al-Hili, a 50-year-old satellite engineer, was vacationing with his family in the Haute-Savoie region of France. His wife Iqbal, who was 47, and her mother Suhaila al-Alaf, 74, were traveling with him along with the couple's 2 daughters. The family had been touring the scenic region in their BMW estate car, taking in the spectacular mountain views. On that September afternoon, they pulled into a lay-by near the village of Chevaline, a remote spot offering panoramic vistas of the surrounding Alps. French cyclist Sylvain Mollier, 45 years old, was riding in the area when he encountered the scene at the lay-by. What happened next remains a matter of investigation and theory, but the outcome was clear. All 4 adults were shot multiple times with a Luger P-06 pistol, an older weapon that would become a key detail in the investigation. The total count reached 21 shots, indicating either multiple shooters or someone methodically ensuring the victims were deceased. The discovery of the crime scene was made by British cyclist Brett Martin, who was riding through the area and came upon the BMW. What he found was horrifying. The car was still running, its engine in reverse gear, with bodies inside and around the vehicle. The al-Hili daughters had survived the attack, though both were injured. The older daughter, Zainab, had been shot and struck with the pistol, while her younger sister, Zina, had hidden beneath her mother's skirts in the footwell of the car, escaping the shooter's notice. The presence of survivors would provide investigators with some information, though trauma limited what could be learned from them. French and British authorities launched a joint investigation, recognizing that the victim's nationality and the location of the crime required cooperation. Multiple arrests were made over the course of the investigation, including Saad's brother, Zaid al-Hili, who was questioned about a potential family dispute over inheritance. However, Zaid was eventually released without charges, and the inheritance theory, while thoroughly investigated, did not lead to a prosecution. Several theories have competed for investigative attention. The inheritance dispute remained one possibility, as there had been tensions within the al-Hili family over property and money. Saad's background as a satellite engineer working on sensitive projects raised questions about whether his work might have made him a target, though investigators found no concrete evidence linking his professional life to the attack. The third major theory centered on Sylvain Mollier as the primary target, with the al-Hilis becoming collateral victims because they witnessed something they shouldn't have. Prosecutor Eric Maillot described a suspect as being at the top of the chain, suggesting organized involvement rather than a lone actor. This characterization aligned with the military precision suggested by the shooting pattern and weapon choice. The Luger pistol, while old, indicated someone with access to weapons and possibly military training. The methodical nature of ensuring all adult victims were deceased suggested professional execution rather than crimes of passion or panic. In 2024, France's cold case unit ordered new DNA testing in the case, reflecting both the enduring interest in solving it and the hope that advancing forensic technology might finally provide the breakthrough that has eluded investigators. The decision to apply new techniques to preserved evidence demonstrates the determination to find answers despite the passage of time. The case has generated extensive media coverage in both France and Britain, with periodic updates as new leads are pursued or investigative approaches are revisited. The randomness suggested by some theories, where a family on vacation and a cyclist out for a ride could become victims of such a calculated attack, deeply unsettled both countries. The alternative theories involving targeted action raise different but equally troubling questions about who wanted these people deceased and why. As of 2025, the French Alps family case remains unsolved. The survivors of the attack have had to rebuild their lives while carrying the trauma of that September day. Investigators continue to pursue leads, and the case remains active in the files of both French and British authorities. The peaceful lay-by where the attack occurred stands as a memorial to a senseless act whose motivation continues to elude explanation. From the calculated precision in France to a night of terror at a Finnish lakeside. Lake Bodom murders. In the early morning hours at a scenic Finnish lakeside campground, 3 teenagers were attacked in their tent on the night of June 4th to 5th, 1960, in what would become Finland's most infamous unsolved case. The brutality of the attack, the mysterious survival of one teenager, and the complete absence of a clear perpetrator have kept the case alive in Finnish consciousness for more than 6 decades. Lake Bodom, located just outside Helsinki, was a popular spot for camping and outdoor recreation. On June 4th, 1960, 4 teenagers set up their tent on the shore for what should have been an ordinary summer camping trip. The group consisted of Mila Björklund and Anja Maki, both 15 years old, Seppo Boisman, who was 18, and Niels Gustafsson, also 15. They settled in for the night with no indication that danger lurked nearby. The attack occurred between 4 and 6 o'clock in the morning, while the teenagers were sleeping. The killer or killers struck from outside the tent, stabbing and bludgeoning the victims through the canvas. Mila Björklund bore the most severe injuries, suggesting either that she was specifically targeted or that she was positioned where the attacker focused their assault. Anja Maki and Seppo Boisman also died from their wounds, while Niels Gustafsson sustained injuries but survived. The tent collapsed during the attack, and the brutality of the assault left investigators with a horrific scene. The bodies were discovered later that morning by other boys who had been in the area, and the local police were immediately called. The crime scene was problematic from the start, with contamination occurring before proper forensic protocols could be implemented. This was 1960, when forensic science was far less sophisticated than it would later become, and the handling of the scene reflected the limitations of the era. Evidence that might have proven crucial in a modern investigation was likely lost or compromised. The investigation explored numerous theories and suspects over the decades. The most controversial development came in 2004, when Niels Gustafsson himself was arrested and charged, based on new forensic analysis that suggested he might have been involved. The theory proposed was that some conflict within the group had led to the attack, though the specifics remained unclear. Gustafsson was tried and acquitted in 2005, with the court finding insufficient evidence to convict him. His acquittal left the case back where it had started, with no identified perpetrator. Other suspects investigated over the years included Valdemar Gillström, a known violent individual who had been in the area, and Hans Assmann, a man with a history of troubling behavior. Neither investigation resulted in charges, as the evidence connecting them to the scene proved insufficient. The challenges of the case included the compromised crime scene, lack of witnesses beyond Gustafsson, whose memory of events was impaired by his injuries, and the absence of modern forensic tools that might have established definitive connections. The motive for the attack has never been determined. Theories have ranged from a crime of passion involving jealousy within the group, to a random attack by a disturbed individual, to some external conflict that brought violence to the campsite. The theft of personal items, including keys and shoes, suggested robbery might have played a role. but the extreme violence seemed disproportionate to such a motive. The concentration of injuries on Mila Björklund has led some to speculate that she was the specific target, though no evidence has emerged to explain why. Gustafsson, now an older man, has lived under the shadow of the case throughout his life. His arrest and trial decades after the event brought renewed attention and trauma, and his acquittal, while legally clearing him, did not end public speculation. He allegedly made a comment that "what's done is done," a statement open to interpretation, but cited by some as suspicious. As of 2025, the Lake Bottom murders remain officially unsolved. The passage of more than 60 years has made it increasingly unlikely that the case will be definitively resolved. Potential suspects have aged or passed away, physical evidence has degraded, and witnesses have faded from memory. From a lakeside in Finland to the streets of Tacoma, where another mystery would unfold in recent memory. Amber Bazan and Wanda Davis. On a cold February evening in 2025, two women were found shot to death in a vehicle in Tacoma, Washington, launching an investigation that remains active and largely without answers. The recency of the case means that many details remain withheld as investigators pursue leads. But what is known paints a picture of a double elimination that has left a community seeking answers about who targeted these women and why. Amber Bazan was 43 years old, and Wanda Davis was 56 when they were found on February 20th, 2025. The women were discovered in a car near St. Paul Avenue in Tacoma, both having been shot in the head in what appeared to be a targeted attack. The discovery was made by firefighters who were responding to a call about unresponsive individuals in a vehicle, and what they found immediately necessitated a call to the Tacoma Police Department. The location of the incident in Tacoma, a city that has grappled with its share of violent incidents, meant that investigators had protocols in place for such scenes. However, the specific circumstances of this case, with two women shot in what appeared to be an execution style, raised questions about whether this was a random act of violence or something more targeted. The fact that both women were in a vehicle together suggested they knew each other, though the nature of their relationship and what brought them to that location remain subjects of investigation. The Tacoma Police Department has been working the case since the discovery. But as of mid-2025, no suspects have been publicly identified and no arrests have been made. The investigation has involved canvassing the area for witnesses, reviewing any available surveillance footage, and working to establish the movements of both women in the hours leading up to their deaths. The challenge in cases like this is often that people in certain neighborhoods are reluctant to come forward with information, either due to distrust of law enforcement or fear of retaliation. What remains unclear is the motive for the double slaying. Were Bazan and Davis targeted specifically, or were they victims of circumstance? The execution style of the wounds suggests a level of intent that argues against random violence. But without knowing more about the women's activities and connections, establishing a motive has proven difficult. Investigators have not released information about whether anything was taken from the vehicle or if there were signs of struggle, details that might help the public understand what occurred. The Tacoma Police Department has encouraged anyone with information about the case to come forward, emphasizing that even details that seem minor might prove significant to investigators. Tips can be provided anonymously, a feature designed to encourage cooperation from people who might be hesitant to openly involve themselves. However, as of the current reporting, no major breaks have been publicly announced. As of 2025, the elimination of Amber Bazan and Wanda Davis remains unsolved. The investigation continues, with detectives pursuing leads and working to build a case that might eventually bring charges. If you've made it this far and enjoy deep dives into the most shocking criminal cases, hit that subscribe button and don't forget to press the bell icon. From recent tragedy to a case that waited 65 years just to know his name. Joseph Augustus Zarelli. For 65 years, he was known only as the boy in the box, America's unknown child. In February 1957, a young boy's body was found in a cardboard box in Philadelphia, wrapped in a blanket and discarded in a wooded area. The case haunted investigators and the public for decades, spawning theories, false leads, and a determination to give this child back his identity. In December 2022, genetic genealogy finally revealed his name, Joseph Augustus Zarelli. The discovery was made in February 1957 by a college student checking muskrat traps in Fox Chase, a neighborhood in northeast Philadelphia. Inside a bassinet box, investigators found the body of a boy who appeared malnourished, with signs of old scars on his body. The condition of the remains and the circumstances of disposal suggested a history of mistreatment. Forensic examination determined that the cause of passing involved blunt force trauma, indicating the boy had been subjected to significant harm before his life ended. The Philadelphia Police Department launched an investigation, but the case quickly became frustrating. No missing persons reports matched the boy's description. No one came forward to claim him or provide information about who he might be. Police distributed flyers with the boy's photograph, and the case received significant media attention, but the leads that came in led nowhere. The mystery of his identity overshadowed even the question of who had harmed him, as investigators couldn't pursue suspects without first knowing who the victim was. The boy was buried in a plot donated by a funeral home, and his gravestone read, "Heavenly Father, bless this unknown boy." The case became embedded in Philadelphia's collective memory, with periodic reviews and renewed appeals for information. Various theories emerged over the decades, including claims from individuals who said they knew who the boy was, but none proved credible when investigated. The lack of a missing persons report suggested that whoever should have reported the boy missing either couldn't or wouldn't, pointing toward either isolation or complicity. Advances in DNA technology eventually provided hope. Genetic material was extracted from the remains and used to build a family tree through genetic genealogy, the same technique that has revolutionized cold case investigations across the country. Investigators worked with genealogists to identify relatives, tracing family lines until they could narrow down possibilities. The process took time and required collaboration between law enforcement, genetic experts, and genealogical researchers. The announcement in December 2022 that the boy had been identified as Joseph Augustus Zarelli brought closure to at least one aspect of the decades-old mystery. Joseph had been 4 years old at the time of his passing. The identification allowed investigators to begin examining his background, looking into his family circumstances and trying to understand how he ended up in that box in Fox Chase. However, both of Joseph's parents had passed away years earlier, complicating efforts to understand the family dynamics that led to his demise. The identification raised as many questions as it answered. Why had no one reported Joseph missing? Who had access to him in the time before his passing? What circumstances led to his mistreatment and eventual demise? Captain Jason Smith of the Philadelphia Police Department stated that investigators have their suspicions about what happened. But suspicions are not the same as evidence sufficient to bring charges, particularly when key individuals are deceased. The case remains officially a homicide investigation, though the likelihood of prosecution dims with each passing year as potential witnesses and perpetrators age or pass away. The identification of Joseph allows for a more targeted investigation. But it also reveals the limitations of pursuing justice decades after events occurred. Physical evidence may no longer exist. Witnesses may have faded memories or be unavailable, and documentation from the 1950s may be incomplete or lost. As of 2025, the investigation continues, with detectives working to build a complete picture of Joseph's life and the circumstances that led to his demise. From one child's tragedy to multiple women who vanished into the desert. West Mesa Bone Collector. In February 2009, a woman walking her dog on Albuquerque's West Mesa made a discovery that would reveal one of New Mexico's most disturbing cases. What began as finding a single bone evolved into the excavation of 11 bodies, all women who had been taken, harmed, and buried in shallow graves on the mesa overlooking the city. The case exposed failures in how missing women from marginalized communities are investigated and highlighted the vulnerability of those living on society's edges. The remains were found in a developing area on Albuquerque's west side, where new housing construction was encroaching on what had been open desert. The discovery of human bones prompted an extensive search of the surrounding area, and as investigators carefully excavated the site, more remains emerged. Eventually, 11 sets of remains were recovered, all women who had disappeared between 2001 and 2005. The concentration of bodies in one location pointed to a single perpetrator or organized operation. Most of the victims were Hispanic women involved in survival activities that made them vulnerable, including exchanges of services for money and substance use. This demographic pattern suggested someone was deliberately targeting women whose disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive investigation. The victims included Monica Candelaria, who was 22 when she vanished, among others whose lives had been marked by the challenges of poverty, substance dependency, and the dangers that come with certain survival strategies. The forensic examination of the site revealed that the bodies had been buried in shallow graves between 2003 and 2005. Based on analysis of soil composition, decomposition, and other physical evidence. Tire tracks found at the site suggested a vehicle had been used to transport the bodies, but linking those tracks to a specific vehicle proved impossible given the degradation and the common tire types involved. The mesa location was remote enough to provide privacy, but accessible enough for someone to transport bodies without requiring specialized equipment or extensive time. The investigation focused significant attention on Lorenzo Montoya, a man who died in 2006. Montoya had a history of harm toward women and lived near the burial site. His residence included a trailer with a secret room, and the circumstances of his own demise, which occurred during a confrontation with a woman who managed to defend herself, suggested he was capable of extreme actions. However, Montoya died 3 years before the bodies were discovered, making it impossible to question him or collect DNA evidence that could definitively link him to the crimes. Joseph Blee was another individual investigated in connection with the case. He had convictions related to attacks on women and fit the profile of someone who might commit such crimes. However, investigators were unable to develop evidence sufficient to charge him with the West Mesa cases. The challenge was that circumstantial suspicion, even when seemingly strong, must be backed by physical evidence or testimony that can withstand legal scrutiny. Families of the victims have expressed the ongoing pain of losing loved ones in such circumstances, compounded by years without resolution. Many of the families had reported their relatives missing, but the investigations into those disappearances were often cursory, reflecting systemic failures in how cases involving marginalized women are prioritized. The discovery of the burial site forced a reckoning with these investigative shortcomings. In 2025, New Mexico considered legislation that would allow DNA testing of deceased suspects like Montoya potentially providing closure for families, even though prosecution is no longer possible. The proposal reflects the desire to answer questions, even when traditional justice cannot be achieved. If Montoya's DNA could be conclusively linked to the victims, it would at least provide certainty about who was responsible, allowing families to stop wondering. The case remains officially unsolved, with a $100,000 reward offered for information leading to resolution. As of 2025, the families of the 11 women continue to seek answers. The desert mesa where their loved ones were buried has been developed into residential areas. The house is built over ground that holds tragic history. From the New Mexico desert to an affluent French suburb, where an entire family would disappear. Dupont de Ligonnès murders. In April 2011, a family vanished from their home in Nantes, France, in circumstances so carefully orchestrated that weeks passed before anyone realized something was wrong. When investigators finally entered the property, they made a discovery that shocked France. 5 bodies buried beneath the back patio. The father of the family, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès, had disappeared and remains one of the world's most wanted fugitives more than a decade later. Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès was born in 1961 into an aristocratic family with a distinguished lineage. By 2011, he was married to Agnès, who was 48, and they had 4 offspring together: Arthur, 21, Thomas, 18, Anne, 16, and Benoit, 13. The family lived in a comfortable home in Nantes, projecting an image of normalcy and respectability. However, beneath that surface, Xavier was facing significant financial pressures that he had concealed from those around him. In early April 2011, Xavier purchased a weapon and silencer, actions that suggested planning rather than impulse. Over the course of several days, he eliminated each member of his family, shooting them with a .22 caliber rifle. He then buried their bodies in the backyard beneath the patio, covering the graves with lime and concrete in an apparent attempt to prevent discovery and mask decomposition. The methodical nature of the crimes suggested someone operating with calculation rather than emotion. What made the case particularly disturbing was Xavier's behavior in the days following the events. He sent letters to family members and friends explaining that the family was entering witness protection as part of a DEA operation, an elaborate fiction designed to explain their sudden disappearance and prevent immediate concern. He withdrew money, paid some bills, and took steps to create the impression that the family had left voluntarily and would be unreachable for an extended period. These actions bought him time to flee before anyone realized what had actually occurred. The bodies were discovered on April 21, 2011, when concerned relatives finally convinced authorities to enter the home. The scene revealed the full horror of what Xavier had done. Investigators found evidence of his preparations, including purchase records and the physical setup of the burial site. What they didn't find was Xavier himself, who had vanished before the discovery. The investigation into Xavier's whereabouts has involved Interpol and law enforcement agencies across multiple countries. Surveillance footage tracked him to the south of France, where the trail went cold. Theories about his fate range from self-elimination in a remote location to successful escape and life under a new identity. In 2019, authorities thought they had found him in Scotland, but the man turned out to be someone else entirely. A false alarm that demonstrated both the intensity of the search and the difficulty of locating someone determined to disappear. Xavier had written about contemplating collective self-elimination, suggesting he had considered alternatives to facing his financial failures. However, the fact that he took elaborate steps to conceal the crimes and create time for escape argues against the notion that he intended to follow his family in demise. His actions appear more consistent with someone who had decided to eliminate his family, rather than allow them to experience the shame and hardship his financial situation would bring, while preserving his own life. Reported sightings have placed Xavier in various locations, including recent claims of sightings in Asia, though none have been confirmed. The challenge of finding someone who has been missing for more than a decade grows with each passing year. As physical appearance changes and the trail grows colder. However, the prominence of the case means that his photograph remains widely circulated, and authorities continue to investigate tips. The motive appears rooted in Xavier's financial desperation and his inability to face the consequences of his failures. Rather than allowing his family to experience poverty or seeking help, he chose elimination. This pattern of family annihilators who eliminate their families rather than cope with catastrophic life changes is well documented in criminal psychology, though understanding the mindset doesn't diminish the horror of the actions. As of 2025, Xavier Dupont de Ligonnès remains a fugitive, wanted by French authorities and Interpol. Whether Xavier is alive or deceased, whether he fled to a remote location or assumed a new identity, remains unknown. From a calculated family elimination to a century-old mystery that still haunts Iowa. Villisca Axe Murders. In the early morning hours of June 10, 1912, someone entered a home in the small town of Villisca, Iowa, and methodically attacked 8 people as they slept. The weapon was an axe found on the property. And when the sun rose on that June morning, a community was left with a horror that has never been explained. More than a century later, the case remains unsolved, and the house where it occurred has become a macabre tourist destination. The Moore family had spent the evening at a church event where they watched a performance. Josiah Moore, who was 43, his wife Sarah, 39, and their 4 offspring, Herman, Catherine, Boyd, and Paul, returned home with 2 guests, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who were staying overnight. The household settled in for what should have been an ordinary night's sleep in their comfortable 2-story home. Sometime between midnight and 5 o'clock in the morning, someone entered the home and moved through the rooms with an axe. Each victim was struck as they slept. The killer working through the house with what appeared to be methodical purpose. Forensic examination showed that both the blunt and blade sides of the axe had been used, suggesting the killer had alternated or used both ends at different points. The attack was silent enough that victims in other rooms didn't wake until the killer reached them. The scene was discovered the next morning when a neighbor, concerned that the family hadn't emerged at their usual time, investigated and found the door locked. When entry was finally gained, the horror inside became apparent. All 8 victims had been attacked in their beds. The killer had taken time after the attacks to cover mirrors in the house and left a slab of bacon on the floor. Details that investigators found deeply unsettling, but couldn't explain. The crime scene was contaminated almost immediately as neighbors and curious onlookers entered before proper investigation could begin, a common problem in that era. The investigation focused on several suspects over the years. Reverend George Kelly became a primary focus after he confessed to the crimes, though he later retracted his confession. Kelly was tried twice, with the first trial resulting in a hung jury and the second in acquittal. His confessions were viewed skeptically because he had a history of mental instability and may have been seeking attention or was genuinely confused about his involvement. Marshal Hank Horton, responding to the scene, reported that someone had been eliminated in every bed, a statement that captured the methodical nature of the attack. The killer had moved through a sleeping household, taking time with each victim, yet apparently not disturbing the others until reaching their rooms. This suggested either incredible stealth or victims who were very sound sleepers? Possibly both. Theories about motive centered on business rivalry involving Josiah Moore, who had been successful and might have made enemies. However, no specific individual with both motive and opportunity was ever definitively identified. The presence of the Stillinger sisters as guests complicated theories about targeted victims, as their presence in the home that night was apparently last minute and wouldn't have been predictable by someone planning an attack on the Moore family specifically. The covering of mirrors has generated extensive speculation. Some have suggested this was a superstition about spirits or reflections. Others that it prevented the killer from seeing their own reflection. And still others that it had some practical purpose unknown to investigators. The bacon slab similarly defies easy explanation, with theories ranging from the killer preparing to eat after the crimes to some symbolic meaning that remains obscure. The house where the events occurred has been preserved and operates as a tourist attraction, offering tours and even overnight stays for those interested in the case. This commercialization of tragedy is controversial, but it has kept the case in public consciousness and generated funding for preservation. The tours emphasize the historical and investigative aspects while acknowledging the human cost of what occurred there. As of 2025, the Villisca axe slayings remain unsolved. The passage of more than a century means that everyone connected to the case, whether victims, suspects, or investigators, has long since passed away. Physical evidence has been lost to time, and modern forensic techniques cannot be applied to materials that no longer exist. From turn-of-the-century Iowa to a modern tragedy in Austin, Texas. Austin Yogurt Shop murders. On the night of December 6, 1991, 4 young women working at a yogurt shop in Austin, Texas, were attacked, harmed, and the shop was set on fire. The case would become one of Texas's most investigated unsolved cases, marked by wrongful convictions, DNA breakthroughs, and families who have waited decades for justice. In 2025, authorities announced that DNA evidence had identified a deceased perpetrator, finally providing answers while raising questions about the years of misdirection that preceded resolution. Amy Ayers was 13, Eliza Thomas was 17, Jennifer Harbison was 17, and Sarah Harbison was 15 when they reported for work at the I Can't Believe It's yogurt shop in Northwest Austin. The shop was located in a strip mall, and the young women were closing up for the night. Sometime before closing, someone entered the shop and took control of the situation. What followed was a series of horrific actions that ended with the shop being set ablaze in an apparent attempt to destroy evidence. Firefighters responding to the blaze discovered the bodies after extinguishing the flames. The victims had been shot, and the scene showed evidence of additional harm before the fire was set. The use of fire suggested someone attempting to eliminate forensic evidence, though the technique was not entirely successful. Despite the fire damage, investigators were able to recover physical evidence, including DNA material that would eventually prove crucial. The investigation generated intense public interest and pressure on Austin police to solve the case. Forensic analysis revealed that weapons including a .22 caliber and a .380 caliber firearm had been used. Male DNA was recovered from the scene, though identifying whose DNA it was would take decades of technological advancement. The initial investigation pursued numerous leads, but failed to identify a credible suspect based on physical evidence. Years after the crimes, 4 men were arrested, based largely on confessions. Michael Scott, Robert Springsteen, and 2 others were charged and tried for the offenses. However, these convictions were eventually overturned when appeals courts found that the confessions had been coerced and that physical evidence didn't support the prosecutions. The wrongful convictions represented a significant failure of the justice system. and added to the trauma experienced by the victims' families, who thought they had closure only to have it taken away. The families endured decades of uncertainty. Amy Ayers' father, Bob, spoke about losing his first dance with his daughter, one of countless moments stolen by the crimes. Detective Jones, working the case, described it as indelibly burned into his memory, reflecting the impact on investigators who dedicated years to seeking justice. The breakthrough came through advances in DNA technology and genetic genealogy. In 2025, authorities announced that DNA from the scene had been matched to Robert Brasher's, a man who had passed away in 1999. Brasher's had been a known serial offender, and linking him to the yogurt shop case finally provided answers about who had been responsible. The fact that Brasher's had been deceased for more than 2 decades meant that prosecution was impossible. But at least families could know who had taken their loved ones. The resolution raises troubling questions about the years spent pursuing the wrong suspects while the actual perpetrator remained unidentified. Had modern DNA techniques been available in 1991, or even in the years immediately following, Brasher's might have been identified before his demise. The wrongly accused men lost years of their lives to incarceration for crimes they didn't commit. A miscarriage of justice that can never be fully remedied. As of 2025, the yogurt shop case is considered solved through DNA identification, though the inability to prosecute due to the perpetrator's demise means it cannot be fully closed in a legal sense. This was all from our side today. Thanks for watching. Click here to check out another video.